So, if you don't like how an election turned out, can you just get a new one? Well, I want to bring in Cagaptay. He's a Turkey specialist with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and author of the book, The New Sultan, Erdogan and the Crisis of Modern Turkey. Great to have you on the show.
It's a pleasure.
So, there's an old Turkish saying, apparently, who wins Istanbul wins Turkey. Is this a case of who wins Istanbul a second time around? Hold on to Turkey.
That's correct. This is Turkey's money-making machine. The city accounts for 30% of Turkey's economy, which is nearly $2.3 trillion in size, measured according to current prices. And it's also a place where you prove that you are an able politician. Remember that Erdogan himself was an unknown figure in Turkey until he became Istanbul's mayor in 1994, a position from which he went to become Turkey's prime minister in 2003 and president in 2015. Erdogan knows that opposition mayor-elect Mr. İmamoğlu, who won the race in Istanbul, if he stays in charge as Istanbul's mayor and has proven himself to be a capable politician, will rise using Istanbul to challenge Erdogan economically and politically, and therefore he wants to nip this challenge in the bud, and therefore has decided to ask the election board to cancel the outcome of the March 31st elections.
So what are the chances of the same result happening again?
Very similar, because opposition in Turkey is resilient, despite the fact that Mr. Erdogan controls over 90% of the media, and taking into account that there are literally no more independent institutions. The election board, for instance, decided to cancel the Istanbul vote less than 48 hours after Mr. Erdogan demanded that. Despite these insurmountable odds, the opposition was able to eke out a victory with a narrow margin, and I think we'll see a similarly competitive race. But at the same time, of course, Mr. Erdogan really holds the ability to even further suppress democratic rights and liberties. And I think it is fair to say that, unfortunately, the next race will be neither free nor fair, given the deteriorating democratic conditions in the country in recent years.
So either way the result goes, what happens next?
What happens next is, unfortunately, Turkey's domestic crisis is only exacerbated. As I highlight in my book, The New Sultan, Mr. Erdogan is both a loved and hated political figure at the same time. I consider him to be the prototype of 21st century populist leaders. He demonizes, cracks down on base and brutalizes demographics that are unlikely to vote for him, and that has earned him a loyal base of conservative followers who simply adore him. But also the groups that he has demonized simply loathe him, and there's no space in the middle. And I think the election results show that Turkey split 50-50 in the middle. Yes, Mr. Erdogan's candidate might win the election by a narrow margin, but it will not address Turkey's crisis in any way or form. I had written a piece just after the elections for the Washington Post arguing that maybe he should become a unifying leader again, because he has lost his magic touch. When he came to power in 2003, he was a forward-looking leader. Whether or not you agreed with his vision, he had a forward-looking vision for Turkey. Not anymore. He needs to reinvent himself, and I think that will be his challenge going forward.
As we know, all politics is personal, and Istanbul, as you've mentioned, is personal for Mr. Erdogan. What do people in Istanbul have to say about this?
It is indeed. I mean, this is the city of his birth and his political rise, but it's also a city that generates a huge amount of rent. It oils the wheels of Mr. Erdogan's political machine, and that's why I think he does not want to lose it. The population in Istanbul, that's majority of them voted against him in this election. And not only that, in 5 out of Turkey's 6 biggest cities, Mr. Erdogan's party lost the mayoral race on March 31st. Put together, the provinces that he lost represent 3/4 of Turkey's economy and over half of Turkey's population. And I think what we have seen, of course, is probably the greatest distortion of Turkey's democracy since 1950, when Turkey had its first free and fair elections. A consensus was formed since 1950 gradually that political power in Turkey changes hands through the ballot box, and that the loser and everybody accepts the outcome, whatever that outcome is. Canceling the election in Istanbul and going for a revote is the greatest distortion of that consensus. I think it takes a long time to build democracies, and it's very sad for Turkish people and Turkish democracy that 70 years of gains of this hard-earned consensus is now being thrown away.
Cagaptay, thanks so much for your perspective.
Thank you.
Author of a fantastic book called The New Sultan. Thanks so much for your perspective. Thanks.